And this is a very special event. Each year we have a distinguished visitor to the program on U.S.-Japan relations. Among them have been Sadako Ogata, the former UN High Commissioner for Refugees and President of the Japan International Cooperation Agency until recently, economist Jeffrey Sachs, of Columbia, political scientist of Cornell, Peter Katzenstein, Yale anthropologist William Kelly, a whole series of distinguished people, but certainly this year's speaker is one we welcome tremendously for the major contribution he's made in so many ways. And currently, he serves as chairman of the Rebuild Japan Initiative Foundation, which dates from 2011, which he established after the March 11 disasters. He has been a distinguished guest professor of Keio University and is well known to many of you because of his role as editor-in-chief and columnist of Asahi Shimbun for quite a long his role in Asahi Shimbun as one of Japan's leading journalists, well known internationally. His bachelor's degree was from University of Tokyo, and then he received his PhD in the Faculty of Law at Keio University. He's the author of many, many prize-winning books, one of them called Managing the Dollar, From the Plaza to the Louvre, which won a major prize in Japan, a book he published with Institute for International Economics, a book on Asia-Pacific fusion, Japan's role in APEC, Institute for International Economics, 1995, the winner of a Mainichi Shimbun Asahi Grand Pacific, Asia Pacific Grand Prix Prize, the Alliance Adrift with the Council on Foreign, U.S. Council on Foreign Relations, the Peninsula Question, looking at the second Korean nuclear disaster, and now he has been the chief architect of a report that has received a great deal of attention, in fact, a lead story in the New York Times, a report that I will hold up, that focuses on what happened in the nuclear disaster of last year in Japan, the disaster, earthquake, and the triple disaster in Japan. May I also mention that he is no stranger to Harvard. He was a Nieman Fellow here in the year 1975 and 76. He was a visiting fellow at the Institute for International Economics, a visiting professor at the Tokyo University's Public Policy Institute, and a distinguished guest scholar at Brookings Institution. So his seminar today looks at the report that he has been so prominent in producing with great leadership in quite a short amount of time. A book, its seminar today is entitled Rebuilding Japan After Fukushima.
Thank you very much. Should I go over there or here? Should I go over there or here?
Oh, up to you, whichever way.
Thank you. Professor Pharr, thank you very much for your generous introduction. I'm very much glad to be back to Harvard. I particularly am very much delighted to see many familiar faces today, and thank you very much for Vogel Sensei to come to today's speech. I would like to share some of our fact findings in our commission and the lesson we should draw from this. And then what kind of implications it will have for Japan's effort to rebuild itself, and possibly its relevance to the world. As we see many particularly emerging countries now planning to build nuclear plants on a massive scale over the next decade or so. We set up this commission about 7 months ago, and we firmly believe that this time it must be different. We really need to come up with independent investigation commission to critically review what went wrong with Fukushima and lessons we must draw. We came up 3 mottos: truth, independence, and humanity. Why we put so much emphasis on the independence is that our deep concern about business as usual attitude to that any crisis repeating once again. Particularly, we have had many governments being shuffled and reshuffled in the past 20 years or so. The Japanese people is very much confused with which administration's which policy was effective and which one not, because that time span of each administration was too short. And we all know that LDP's tried and tested policy, particularly in the past 20 years, did not work at all. But at the same time, the DPJ's manifesto also have not been working at all. So where to start over is a very much crucial question for the Japanese public policy debate. Yet, I think Japan has serious problem of not developing genuinely independent public debate sphere, space, I should say. Many ideas, concepts, and policies have been very much confined to already convinced, very much homogeneous intellectual community. It has been very much interlocking, highly embedded in each other, and the dissenting views are not welcome. And this conformity actually has really been the root cause of that Japanese public space. So we believe that this time it has to be different. We do not represent any vested interests. We are not beholden to any political interests. We have to be thoroughly independent. And then, unless and until we really have to scrutinize, vet the root cause and background of the Fukushima, we just cannot formulate any viable strategy to rebuild Japan. That's our belief. But to be more specific, what we learned, what we found out, let me share some of our fact findings with you today. First, we are struck with how thoroughly TEPCO and the government as well were unprepared for that nuclear accident. There are many reasons why, but to wit, the most crucial part of the puzzle is that this shared myth of absolute safety among the regulators as well as the regulated. This has developed over the years, particularly since 1970s when anti-nuclear movement gained more ground and gained more momentum. The utilities and the MITI at that time were very much concerned about this thrust and its negative impact on that nuclear energy in Japan. So they started to propagate this absolute safety. Given this hypersensitive nature of that nuclear development since Hiroshima and Nagasaki experience, this anti-nuclear sentiment has been very much deeply embedded in Japan. So it's very difficult for the utilities to persuade the public that nuclear energy is safe. So they have been very much on the defensive. But they have formed what is called nuclear village, consisting the regulator, operator, and particularly academics and media to be designed to promote nuclear energy. And gradually, they have gained their ground. But in the process, they have to take into account of that, particularly the residents in that vicinity of the nuclear plants, their fear and their concerns. They have responded to that with a lot of sweeteners, lubricants, tax exemptions, and the others. And this has formed a huge political interest. And Japanese utilities a monopoly, and the power balance between the utilities and the regulators is lopsidedly favored towards the utilities, because the utilities has a strong political clout. They have also very much strong influence over the labor union. So they have both have connections with both DPJ and LDP. But more importantly, they have much better expertise vis-a-vis the regulator. As illustrated in the Fukushima, the regulators revealed a thorough ineptness and lack of qualification in dealing with that crisis. And that's the reason why Prime Minister Kan looked to the outside specialists to give him advice how to cope with that crisis, simply because that the top regulators, top management were totally inadequate for giving advice, good counsel to him. But this myth actually has caused the big problem, because they have been highly reluctant, both regulator and utilities, to backfit the existing facilities by incorporating the new scientific findings and the technological innovation for improved safety. Making such changes would be an admission that existing precautions and procedures are insufficient, and operators do not possess that absolute safety. So they have set their own perimeter of the unanticipated, within which they have to be accountable of ensuring their safety, but beyond which they do not necessarily feel accountable. Why stop unnecessary anxiety when the contingencies simply unthinkable? In Japan, we have not developed contingency planning. We have abhorred at introducing the unthinkable in the contingency planning, particularly in case of nuclear safety. They have shuddered at even the idea of thinking of the unthinkable, because that would cause unnecessary anxiety and misunderstanding in the public. When Niigata Prefecture, Governor Izumida made plans to conduct a nuclear accident drill in 2010. As you recall, Niigata was hit hard in 2007 by the big earthquake. So they wanted to conduct a nuclear accident drill premised on that earthquake. NISA, the Nuclear and Industrial Safety Agency, advised the Governor Izumida that combination of accident and earthquake would cause unnecessary anxiety and misunderstanding. So Governor Izumida was duly obliged and to drop the drill premised on the earthquake in favor of less menacing alternative, heavy snow. After JCO accident, Recurricality accident in 1999, many Japanese manufacturers and universities such as Chiba Technological University started to develop robots specifically designed to work under the radiation atmosphere. And also METI and tried to promote that. Eventually, there were no purchasers who are interested in purchasing it. All the utilities, no utilities, none of them was interested in procuring it, simply because that to do that would give impression that existing nuclear facility is not 100% safe. Okay. So this is a very, very twisted myth. But up until March 11, this myth has been so much pervasive and widely accepted among the Japanese nuclear village. Another problem is Japan's regulatory regime. It proved to be turned out to be very much hollow, phony even. The regulators pretended to regulate, and the utilities pretend to be regulated. They certainly formed a very much sweetheart relationship between two. But more than that, stovepipe structure and risk averseness on the part of the regulators and the related agencies and overlapping agencies did not help, did not do service to that strengthening that regulation in Japan. We have NISA, IMETI, in charge of safety. Also, Nuclear Safety Commission, in charge of also in safety. Whereas MEXT, Ministry of Education and Science and Technology, they are in charge of safeguards. And Japan's Atomic Energy Commission is in charge of security. So it's all divided. And when chips are down, when we have this kind of crisis, tough battle have become to be very much intense in the way that no agency is willing to take risks. We have called the 消極的権限争い in Japan. Very much passive, tough battle. Many people criticize Prime Minister Khan for his micromanagement. Certainly he perhaps overdid in some cases. But how else would a political leader, when faced with this stovepipe structure and risk averseness in the bureaucracy, how else would have the political leader really coped with that crisis such as Fukushima Daiichi? TEPCO was highly reluctant to share the information with the government. And when we had Unit 1 explosion in the afternoon on March 12th, it took more than 2 hours for TEPCO to report that this explosion to Prime Minister's office, even though Prime Minister's office repeatedly asked TEPCO to provide the information. And NISA just kept asking TEPCO to provide the information for them. They did not station their own inspectors on the on-site, even though they had those 4 inspectors fled to the off-site center from the Fukushima Daiichi on-site on the following day. And they were instructed by the Met Minister Kaeda to return to inspect whether that water injection was smoothly operated or not. But then when they had we had another nuclear the explosion in Unit 3 in the morning on the 14th. These inspectors once again fled to offsite center. This actually posed a serious dilemma, problem to Prime Minister Khan, because on the one hand, Prime Minister felt compelled to tell TEPCO not to abandon the ship. He entreated the civilian workers of TEPCO to put their lives on line as Unit 2 had started to deteriorate, and TEPCO top management started to indicate to Prime Minister's office they would have no choice but to withdraw the workers from the site. On the one hand, Prime Minister Khan asked the TEPCO workers to continue to respond to the crisis. And on the other hand, the government officials, NISA inspectors, had already started to evacuate from their own site. So he looked to self-defense forces, and he mobilized that on a massive scale, and assigned them to keep injecting water. So at the end of the day, it was the self-defense forces to put their lives online, as well as TEPCO workers. It revealed to a great extent how unprepared Japan was in face of that crisis on this scale. This phobia of worst case scenario, thinking of the unthinkable, has had a deep root, in my view, and it has had something to do with Japan's pacifism in post-World War II. This pacifistic approach, and pacifistic to the point of avoidance approach to worst case scenario, to a national security, actually has been matched by this phobia with regard to the nuclear energy safety. In either case, we have been very much reluctant to think of the unthinkable, to think of the contingency planning. In the thick of the crisis, Prime Minister Khan instructed the chairman of Japan's Atomic Energy Commission, Kondo Shunsuke, to draw up a contingency plan, a worst-case scenario, which he submitted to Prime Minister Khan on March 25th. And if this scenario, worst-case scenario, becomes a reality, it would have involved the evacuation of 30 to 35 million people in Tokyo greater metropolitan area. This is unprecedented in Japan's post-war history for a Japanese government to come up with the contingency planning given in face of the enormity of the crisis, almost existential crisis it posed. So March 11 and Fukushima Daiichi revealed lack of vision in Japan. Lack of vision for national security state. Too long, Japanese politicians and policymakers have emphasized the safety in a small dose. And it may have inadvertently sacrificed security of the nation at large. Perhaps March 17th, 16th was the most bleak moment in that crisis, when people saw self-defense forces helicopter turning around after they hovered over that Fukushima Daiichi Unit 3. People expected self-defense forces to drop heavy water and inject water into the pool. Yet the radiation level was too high, and they gave up on the operation. I happened to read literary critic Kamura Akira's essay in which he said, please, self-defense forces, get it done. And I had been opposed to the very existence of self-defense forces. He's a bit more leftist, if not left-wing, literary critic. I have very much liked to read his essays for many years. But I think with those words, he particularly spoke for virtually the whole nation, Japanese nation. And I was one of them. I even prayed for self-defense forces, helicopter dropping water. So I was devastated when I saw them turning around. But the following day, March 17th, in the morning, they finally succeeded in dropping water. Even though it was just symbolic, only 10 tons out of 30 tons perhaps found a way into that pool. And it was not sufficient at all. But that was the first time for the Japanese public to see Japanese soldiers trying to defend its own country. And I think this is no insignificant moment for the Japanese to see the self-defense forces playing as a last bulwark to defend Japan, to protect the lives of the Japanese people. We saw many lapses of judgment and many deficiencies in operation and preparedness in Japan this time. But self-defense forces did a superb job And they learned lesson, actually, from 1995 Hanshin-Awaji great earthquake. They were bitterly criticized for their laggard initial response in the wake of that earthquake. So they have been preparing pretty well, and they mobilized, Prime Minister mobilized 100,000 self-defense forces in about a week. And this is no small feat. When you think of the Chinese government mobilizing 47,000 soldiers in face of that, in the wake of that Sichuan great earthquake, 2008, it took 24 days for them to do that. Certainly, China has much vaster area, so you just cannot compare. But still, I think the self-defense forces, I think did a really good job this time, and people really appreciate that. 93% of the Japanese now strongly endorses and favors self-defense forces, and this is that unprecedentedly high approval rate for self-defense forces. When Mr. Khan stormed into the headquarters of TEPCO with his team at 5:35 in the morning on March 15th, he made an impromptu 10-minute speech to more than 200 TEPCO employees. And we interviewed Prime Minister Khan and his team extensively, and particularly on this venture. And we learned that Prime Minister Khan said various things, but two things struck me most. The first one was that, as I told you, he even begged that workers of TEPCO not to abandon the ship. But secondly, perhaps more interestingly, he said to the effect that if we would abandon, then Japan would stop being a viable nation. International community would have to intervene. Perhaps the United States, either the United States or Russia, would have no choice but to intervene. And then we will lose the status of the sovereign nation. And we would end up being occupied by foreign forces. I was really struck to learn the wording he used at the most critical juncture of the crisis. This is a sort of map of it's revealed his mental map when he was stricken, deeply fearful of the predicament. But once again, I think that this really revealed a new awareness on the part of former citizens and civil activists, such as Mr. Khan, who was never perceived to have a better sense of a nation. He concluded that ultimate task for the Prime Minister was to defend Japan's sovereignty, and unless Japan would be willing and able to defend its own country, the US-Japan Alliance would not be workable. So after March 11 self-defense forces operation of injecting water, he said to his team that now we can ask the United States to help us because we demonstrated that we have a strong will to defend Japan and to cope with the crisis. I think March 11 moment is finally telling us the end of long, long post-war of Japan. This new realization of that somebody having to defend the country and protect the people to put their lives on line, and for the political leadership to defend its country and sovereignty, and then by doing so, only by doing so, Japan can ensure that viability of the US-Japan Alliance. So with that word, I'd like to finish my first presentation. I'll be delighted to respond to any questions. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank Mr. Funabashi for what a remarkable presentation today. And I'd like to open it up to you to direct questions to him by way of introducing yourself. Could you mention your affiliation, if you are here as a visitor, your affiliation in your regular life, as well as any affiliation you might have at Harvard? Who would like to open it up? Yes, Ezra Vogel.
You sound so pessimistic and critical. Where do you see some hope for resolution of some of those big issues?
I don't think that I am that pessimistic because perhaps very much belatedly 3/11 moment has helped the Japanese political leader truly appreciate their role as a leadership and the critical need to reshape Japan, and particularly come up with a new vision of for national security state. I think that's very good. And also, as I told in my remarks, that finally the Japanese citizens have come to terms with that self-defense forces as a military force. And it's all, again, belated. But this is, I think, very much, crucial. So I think I have regarded them as a positive side. On the more specific policy issues, it's very difficult to be more optimistic, actually. We have yet to settle any major issues, whether it's a debris disposal or decontamination or getting people back to their normal life. We still have more than 110,000 people in evacuation, and only 6% of all the debris has been disposed. And 22 million tons of debris have been accumulated in a vast area in those three prefectures. And the debris in Fukushima will remain to be the most difficult to dispose because of that radiation fear. So I think that those onus will be on that next generation, and they will have to pay a high price for this. This will inevitably pose a very critical new issue, agenda, I should say, that is about intergenerational fairness in Japan. The younger generation, whether it's energy or fiscal, they will have to pay for high price for all of these negative legacies. And I think that has already stimulated a lot of concerns and public debates already. And perhaps that the emergence of Hashimoto Toru may be a harbinger of the things to come in this context.
Yes, in the back.
Thank you. I'm Bob Giles. I'm the former curator of the Neiman Fellowship Program, so welcome on that regard. I'd like to know your view on what the Japanese press may have learned from this experience.
I'm very glad you raised this question. I have been thinking of this many times. I don't have any good answer, but foreign press actually was much more alarmed with the prospect meltdown much earlier. But perhaps they reported very much irresponsibly. But at the end of the day, they gave very strong signal and warning, and that was the right thing. In stark contrast, the Japanese press, major mass media, perhaps too much followed the government official line. They were too much, I think, receptive to that government version of stories. They were perhaps agonizingly slow of appreciating that the serious deterioration on the ground, because the government did not want to cause panic in the public. But they were also challenged this time greatly by that social networks, Twitters, and the blogosphere. There are many tweets suggesting the alternative scenario. And they also cited the foreign sources to challenge the Japanese government public policy. Press briefings. So mass media was also not only challenged by the foreign media reporting, but also that social networks, particularly younger generation people, depended more on that social networks for their judgment, their information. It's very much different from that 1995 Hanshin Awaji earthquake. At that time, when that blogosphere still had not even been born. So that was the initial state. But in subsequent months, I think some Japanese media did a really superb job in investigating critically what was happening and why we did not report the way we should have done. NHK, and I wouldn't have names, but there are many, some mass media who really focused on investigative reporting, and that has been very much helpful. And we actually, as an independent investigation commission, benefited greatly from the Japanese journalism, muckraking and fact-finding on Fukushima Daiichi crisis.
This is really a related question and comment, but one of the striking things, and I mentioned this to you earlier, but when the report came out on the coverage on the Japanese side, the report had just been really quite critical of the DPJ and of Prime Minister Khan, whereas when the New York Times reported on the report itself and its findings, its lead story in the New York Times stressed this role that Khan played in forcing TEPCO to, and pleading with them to keep at it in trying to deal with the crisis. So in many ways, despite other mistakes you can point to, Khan was a hero of the hour. And yet that side of the story has really received very little play in Japan. And I wonder why you think that is.
Yes, I think people are really now trying to grasp for leadership and how to see Khan's leadership and leadership style still is very much divisive and even polarizing. You're right in saying that Japanese media basically has been very much critical of the way Prime Minister Khan handled on that crisis, whereas some foreign media, particularly European media, I was very much aware of that when I was in Davos, and I played a moderator for Prime Minister Khan's presentation to the audience. And European reporters actually, some of them even praised for Prime Minister Khan's decisive leadership at that time. So it's a very much contrast between the way Khan was portrayed as a leader in a time of crisis. In our report, we have tried to put him and his leadership in a very much balanced way. He perhaps may have been engaged in too much what is called micromanagement, but perhaps put it more accurately, accident management. Rather than crisis management. He should have perhaps performed much more as a general rather than trooper. He made some lapses of judgment, but at the most critical juncture, I think he did the right thing, as I said, and his decision not to allow TEPCO to abandon and his decision to set up a mutual headquarters in TEPCO's headquarters between the government and TEPCO, I think was the right one. And some perhaps would say that that was his finest hour. And you also have to think of that, how inept that his advisors were, and how he also had to be confronted with that stovepipe and risk averseness in that bureaucracy. And in the time of crisis, that speed is most critical, and bureaucracy is not structured well. to respond to the crisis in very much timely fashion. They are built basically very much in routine and well-run bureaucracy usually values that compliance with law and efficiency, fairness, and perhaps bottom-up deliberations. But in time of crisis, what you need is perhaps you may have to break some laws sometimes, and you need some redundancy, and you have to set very much clear priorities, and you also have to make decision top-down. So you have to really change the mode into the crisis mode, and that really requires a strong political leadership. And I think Prime Minister Kan actually tried to do that very hard to change that mode, routine mode of the bureaucracy into the crisis mode of the bureaucracy. How far he was successful remains to be seen, but I think at least he tried very hard.
Mr. Nakamura of Yomiuri Shimbun.
I'm Hiro Nakamura from Yomiuri newspaper and US-Japan program. Thank you for a great presentation here today at Harvard. Welcome back. I have two questions about leadership and the role of media. As Funabashi mentioned, we have lack of vision, and your investigation report shows the very poor management at some side, the bureaucrat, Prime Minister's office, and TEPCO. So how do you think how we should rebuild the robust leadership in public sector and private sector? So the political environment now is every year we change the Prime Minister, so we do not have the proper environment to think about the robust leadership right now. So how do you think about that? Secondly, once again, I'd like to ask you, as a media person, I'd like to ask you, role of media. From my experiences, at that critical moment, we only rely on the government information about a couple of days at the beginning of the crisis. So we do not have find enough alternative information channel. So how do we act as an acting press at the critical moment, like earthquake and nuclear catastrophe?
Well, Nakamura-san, thank you very much for your questions. On the first question, leadership, one would tend to now conclude that what we really need is strong leadership in time of crisis, particularly. And I wouldn't refute that. I think that should be the case. But in the Japanese political context, I think what we really needed and still do is consensus leadership rather than a strong leadership. Prime Minister Kan actually failed in making consensus among that even DPJ. In DPJ, he was poor at communicating, particularly with the public on the emotional level, particularly. But he also was poor at communicating with bureaucrats. And that actually has been very much important. And very much unfortunate for the bureaucrats not to trust DPJ, particularly Prime Minister Kan, and vice versa. And then we are hit by this crisis. And this uneasy relationship and strained relationship between the politicians and bureaucrats in DPG administration actually really hampered that response. At least that they compromised, otherwise much more effective measures to be taken. So I think that in times of crisis, top leader just cannot dictate his own term or her own terms to the people or to his underlings and officials. It requires partnership in a very much effective way. And he or she really has to do nemawashi in Japan's case, and to foster that atmosphere of consensus. That has been lacking in Japanese politics recently, more than the lack of strong leadership, in my view. On the second question, yes, there are so many unknowns, particularly in the initial stage of the crisis. There was a lot of fog of war, actually. And we simply did not have any alternative but to depend on the government official briefings. But at the same time in Japan, I think press club really pose a problems in my view, as we delved into this investigation this time. For instance, take an example of SPEEDY. SPEEDY is a system for protection of environment emergency dose information. That was designed to forecast the diffusion of radiation and to help, in order to help the government, facilitate the government with better evacuation measures. It remained to be unused this time because of the reluctance and resistance from that mixed and nuclear safety commission. Some people still are very much angry with that government resistance to that, because those who particularly were relocated in the direction of heavy dose, heavy radiation, even though that the SPEEDY strongly suggested the similar direction of Purun moving. They could have taken a different road, and they could have been relocated in a different place. So they're very, very angry. But officially, the political leaders in Prime Minister's office was informed and briefed on this on the 23rd of March. Too late, okay? But in the press club of MEXT, reporters kept asking why that SPEEDY was not activated, okay? But there was no report in the Japanese press and the TV as far as we investigated. So I think the press club, somebody really should have, utter a word and scream that why SPEEDY is not in use, and it should have been written on the front page of major newspaper. Okay, I don't know why that the reporters in the press club of MEXT did not report, or they tried to report. I don't know. Perhaps we should have delved into further, which we didn't.
Professor Margarita Estaves Abe, who was formerly a postdoc of the program and former professor of Harvard, now at Syracuse University.
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. And I'm going to be a bit greedy, and I will ask you two questions. The first one is about the press club. So recently there was a very interesting internet TV program where two Asahi Shimbun journalists made an appearance to engage in a conversation about problems in Japanese journalistic reporting. And these two Asahi journalists were involved in the series in Asahi, Prometheus no Wana. And one of the older ones said that maybe there was some change in the culture in Asahi Shimbun that just took place even before he just joined the company. So he was sort of suggesting that this whole problem of press club might have led to the deterioration of reporting skills of journalists. Whereas he was sort of suggesting that maybe just, so the negative effect of press club may not have always been present in Japan. So as someone who have sort of inside knowledge of the Japanese media, I would be sort of interested in your observation of whether the problem of press club may have become more problematic today.
What is specific on this?
No,
to reporters?
Yeah, so because press club has always existed, but some of the journalists which is existing were arguing that the press clubs might not have been having such a negative impact on the reporting skills of the journalist. But today, even they were just admitting that press club has just led to a much cozier relationship between those who are being, the journalists and those who are being the target of the journalistic sort of investigation. So that's sort of one thing. If there was just any qualitative change that has occurred in the Japanese media. The second one is I found your last closing sort of remark extremely interesting, that you characterized March 11th as sort of marking the end of the post-war period in Japan. And you characterized that as the moment where the Japanese state or the government expressing its will to defend itself. I just wonder to what extent, well, and you also just said that this would just impact the US-Japan sort of relationship too. So I just wanted to ask you to what extent the American government sort of shares that observation.
Very interesting. Thank you. Both questions are very interesting. The first question, when I was editor-in-chief of Asahi Shimbun, I keenly realized that press club hurts more than benefits that quality reporting, particularly investigative reporting. And I think in the age of that this blogosphere inundated with that so many informations or semi-informations that investigative reporting, the value and importance of that is increasing and will be increasing further, in my view. So I actually launched a new special squad of investigative reporting. And I was very much glad to read every day in the Asahi Shimbun, Prometheus no Wana, the Trap of Prometheus, because that was the product of this hard investigative reporting. The press club reporters simply cannot produce this kind of reporting. I have belonged to many press clubs myself. As I have covered 43 years as a reporter, and I do not automatically deny that some values of press club. Okay, it depends on us how to utilize that. But in Japan, unfortunately, once you are stationed in press club, you are too much embedded with a routine reporting. Cozy relationship, I don't think that they have developed such a cozy relation because they have emerged very much strained relationship on and off. But basically, their perspectives and agenda setting are quite similar. They are in a box, okay, and that's more problem, in my view. So you really need to pursue and explore alternative reporting. That should be investigative reporting. So that's my answer to your first question. And the second question, I'm sorry, you raised a question of Japan's end of long post-war. And sorry, would you?
Whether the American official.
American official, I'm sorry, yeah. The Obama administration was deeply frustrated with that lack of engagement on the part of the Japanese government, particularly in the initial stage. They wondered why the Japanese government seemed to delegate this vital role to TEPCO, a private operator, and why the Japanese government did not mobilize self-defense forces to be assigned to the on-site operation. They gave strong messages to the Japanese government, particularly around 15th and 16th. They dispatched a nuclear regulatory commission specialist to Japan immediately. They were not well briefed. They were not well shared. They could not share the information with their counterpart NISA and NSC, Nuclear Safety Commission in Japan. So that particularly in the initial stage, that way they cooperated was not that smooth, even though that Tomodachi operation has been well heralded and fanfared as a big success story. But when you look into that details more clearly, there was a very much serious problems. And when the United States administration introduced that 50 miles travel advisory, and while the Japanese maintained a 20 kilometers radius evacuation zone, and that also produced a cause of tension. But eventually, I think that after the Khan ordered the self-defense forces to drop water, I think they laid the ground for the much better of cooperation. And then March 22nd, when the U.S. and Japanese government convened a joint consultation process. It's called the Hosono process. I think that they really helped that way they cooperated in much more smooth way.
Yes.
Hello. My name is Kimito Sugiyama. I'm a research associate of US-Japan program, and also I'm a member of Japan Air Self-Defense Force. One of my close friends, as a squadron leader, went to Fukushima to conduct a mission to shoot the water from the ground. He didn't have any expertise on nuclear issue, and the equipment was supposed to put down the fire on the airfield. So it was really a hard task, I guess. But he went there due to his sense of responsibility, I guess. He didn't tell even his wife he went to the Fukushima Daiichi, because I guess he didn't make his wife and children sad. And I think he was so devoted, so he had to lead his subordinate. Even he was lieutenant colonel, so he doesn't have to be there, basically, but he decided to go there. And by the way, I have a question that self-defense force, do you think self-defense force should have the specific mission or specific equipment to deal with nuclear accidents from now on?
Well, Sugiyama-san, thank you for your question. Yes, I think he was one of many self-defense forces officers and soldiers who duly and diligently did their task. And I really have admired them. Whether the self-defense forces will be full-fledged way equipped and should be equipped with that this assignment, I think given that Japanese government structure, we are not likely to see a FEMA kind of agency being created in the foreseeable future, even though in our reports we recommended we should set up FEMA kind of forces to cope with that nuclear severe accident. I think it perhaps is reasonable for us to expect that self-defense forces to further strengthen its preparedness with that nuclear severe accident. They already have been very well prepared for chemical and biological. But I think that this experience should stimulate their interest and get them much deeply committed to the nuclear accident management mission. And that should be officially a part of that self-defense forces roles and mission, in my view.
Professor Andrew Gordon.
Thank you. Andrew Gordon in the History Department. Thank you for coming, Funabashi-san, and it's great to have you back on campus. I have a question about the implications or explicit recommendations. I haven't read it, so I'm not sure if it was in there, of your report for the future of nuclear energy. One way to understand the purpose of a report like this would be to enable the reconstruction of a better system to manage the nuclear energy program so that it can continue in the future. And the other way would be to say that there is no such thing as absolute safety and the risks are so great that we should move towards winding down and ending reliance on nuclear energy. And what is the overall, either implicit or explicit, thrust of the report is my question. And my concern is that or not my concern, but what's really struck me about your talk that was so powerful today was the point that there's a myth of absolute safety that was a twisted idea and was powerful. To the extent that politically the only way to carry forward a nuclear program would be to reconstruct an absolute faith in safety, how can you get to that point? And that won't the same types of risks then be recreated? In other words, is there a way forward that recognizes there is no absolute safety and yet convinces the public to accept the riskiness?
I think that's the only way for the Japanese government to pursue a nuclear energy path. On the one hand, they have to tell the truth to the public that there is huge risks involved in any types of the nuclear energy or nuclear plants. But at the same time, they have to persuade the public that nuclear energy still is a viable part of the Japan's nuclear balance. And it's really requires a very skillful leadership and persuasion. But you just cannot try to convince the public with that 100% proof, safe, absolute safety formula any longer, because people simply is not convinced. They have all seen through this. We have been very careful not to include this pro or anti-nuclear in our scope. We have excluded. Otherwise, you just cannot maintain 30, strong-willed people, because we have intensely anti-nuclear on the one hand and sort of pro-nuclear on the other. We have drafted 3 best and brightest PhD candidates from Tokyo University Nuclear Engineering. That's a citadel of the nuclear village. Okay, but on the other hand, we have also very strong anti-nuclear crowds too. But it's very, very fruitful in a way eventually. But I think, as far as I'm concerned, I have been sort of agnostic on this issue. I have never covered the nuclear energy per se, even though I covered the energy in 1973, the first oil shock, as a reporter. And so I tended to view the nuclear energy as a very much important alternative energy to Japan, which depends so much oil or imported oil from Middle Eastern countries. And it's really necessary for Japan to lessen its dependence on Middle Eastern oil. And nuclear energy is a safeguard. And since the mid-1990s, as we are very much keenly aware of that, global warming, once again, the nuclear energy has been heralded as a safeguard. And I also have tended to view that nuclear energy from that perspective too. So I may have been a bit too naive myself. But now I think politically, first of all, politically, it's extremely difficult for the Japanese government to convince the public that we still will have to maintain the sizable portion of nuclear energy. And at the same time, I think we really have to set a long-term goal, vision, of course, of divesting, lessening dependence on nuclear energy. We really need the government to give a strong signal to the market to accelerate the energy shift. So we have many entrepreneurs now plunging into this renewable energy field. I did actually some research on the Kanto Great Earthquake in 1923 after March 11. And I wrote that in my essay. The whole origins of Toyota and Panasonic and Sharp all dated back to that Kanto Great Earthquake in 1923. In Toyota's case, they changed their business from textile into automobile. because automobile was mobilized to help the people in the affected area. American Jeep first appeared in the wake of that great earthquake, and they helped people. They provided water and food. So Jeep, that's a word, was transplanted since that time. In 1927, in Tanaka Giichi cabinet, actually assembled made in Japan automobiles in front of the Prime Minister's office to demonstrate that this automobile will be the future of Japan. Okay? So the government made a very clear signal to the market. In Panasonic case, Matsushita Konosuke, the founder, actually had developed a bicycle battery. Bicycle bubble, I should say. But he realized that the batteries were so crucial in time of crisis. And so he changed the business, ventured into battery business. And in Sharp's case, Hayakawa, the founder of Sharp, lost his wife and children in the earthquake. And then he realized that radio manufacturing will be the future, because radio was introduced in that crisis. And the NHK started to broadcast 2 years after that Kanto great earthquake. So that was the origin of the Sharp. Okay, so all those global companies all dated back to that great earthquake, and I think that this scale calamity, disaster, will be a fertile ground for creative destruction, and that's what was having been happening since that March 11, in particular in the field of renewable energy. I, for one, happen to know at least a dozen entrepreneurs who are now driven to develop this. Okay, so who knows? In 10 years, 15 years, Japan could be really ahead of the renewable energy. I think we really have to develop expectation rather than sticking to the current source of power as a nation. Okay, if we be able to develop that renewable energy, certainly, it will be more costly, and the people will have to share the price. But eventually, I think it would pay off handsomely, in my view.
Well, on that note, I'm afraid we're at the end of our time. I'd like to thank all of you for coming today and thank Funabashi-san for a splendid presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.